Ahead of the 12th and final plague in this week's parasha, the death of the firstborns, Moshe tells Pharaoh what time the plague will strike. And Rashi gives us two interpretations of what Moshe is telling Pharaoh. Why do we need two interpretations? What's bothering Rashi? And why is it important for Pharaoh to know the time of the plague anyway? Especially when you consider he wasn't even told which day the plague would happen. Commenting on the pasuk where Moshe quotes Hashem to Pharaoh saying, at kachatzos of the night, Hashem is going to go into Egypt and smite the firstborns. Rashi quotes those two words, kachatzos alayla, and gives two explanations. The first one is Aleph, pshutoi liyoshvei aloif naviz. The simplest explanation to suit the context as the taish from kachatzos alayla is kehei cholek halayla. That the word kachatzos over there means the division, the splitting of the night. When the Nacht zertelt, at the time where the night is split into the earlier and later part of the night, that's when Hashem is going to strike. And Rashi tells us that if you go with this interpretation, the word chatzos is not a description of half, rather it is halbanach, nasiza peula. It is an action, it's a verb. Rashi brings of kama dugmos, and he quotes various examples where you see that the Torah uses a descriptive word actually as a verb. That's explanation number one, and then Beis Rabbi Seina Dorshu. Then he quotes that our sages interpret the pasuk to mean kemoi ke bechatzos alayla. It's like saying at around about midnight. And they explain in this medrash that Moshe told Pharaoh it will be around about midnight, and the reason he was deliberately vague is Shema yitu itstagnine Pharaoh. In case the astrologers of Pharaoh get the time wrong, they didn't have watches in those days. And they'll say Moshe is fake. Fake news. Chatzos is dot Hashem davar shel chetzi hal benacht. In this interpretation, chatzos is a noun that describes midnight. The reason Rashi Moshe says kachatzos around about midnight, when it bachatzos b'diuk, not saying exactly at midnight, is because he's worried about the Egyptian astrologers getting it wrong. Und dennoch ist Hashem assigned coming here so is Saval Kodesh Baruch Hu Yodeh Ita V'Ragov Amar Bachatzos. But Hashem knows times perfectly, and therefore when Hashem tells Moshe about this plague, he says exactly at midnight. So what's bothering Rashi over here? Learned the Mizrahi and Noch Meforsh in the Mizrahi and other common commentaries on Rashi say as the Shverkat in Pasuk that what's bothering Rashi in this Pasuk is was Rashi compared from it Tzvei Pirushim, and that's what Rashi wants to address with these two interpretations. Is Aterch v'Dekasha in Gemara, similar to the question the Gemara asks: Mi'ika Sveika Kamesh Maya? Is there doubt in Hashem's world that you have to say around about midnight? Because if you're interpreting chatzos as midnight, then you're saying that the word, the chof that precedes the word chatzos is giving us a time frame. Like the examples that Rashi quotes, that the Mizrahi quotes, like around about 10 days, around about an ephah of barley by Rus. Das heißt ungefähr, be'erech, arum der Zeit für Chatzos. In other words, kachatzos means around about, not exactly, not precisely midnight on the nose. That's what's bothering Rashi, apparently, according to the Mizrahi and others. That implies that we're not sure. We don't know exactly at which point Hashem is going to strike. And you cannot say that the Eibush is unsure about a time. Therefore, you'd have to say that it needs an interpretation. Etc. As we're going to see again, Rashi brings two possible ways to address this doubt. Either Aleph kachatzos alayla meant kehicholak alayla. Actually, chatzos in this case does not mean midnight. It means the division of the night into two. In which case the prefix of chof is not like or near or about, but rather as or when. In other words, ka'asher yecholak alayla punkt in hal b'nacht. Exactly as the night splits, that's when Hashem is going to strike. And therefore there is no doubt at all. Great explanation. Or, alternatively, or maybe we have to acknowledge that chatzos means around about midnight. Now, because the Eibishter has doubts, but rather, Moshe hat also gesagt, Shema Yitucholei, aber der Eibishter hat gesagt, Bachatzeis den genommen Zman. It's Moshe speaking to Pharaoh when he uses a less specific time and says around Chatzos, whereas the Eibishter says Bachatzeis exactly. Sounds great. The issue is we're addressing the apparent doubt and saying it's not an issue. However, we have to understand, was is the hechich zu sagen, hang on, who says that prefix has to be so problematic? Even if you want to say chatzos means midnight, and kachatzos means around midnight, doesn't mean that I'm uncertain. Could be I'm saying around midnight, not because I'm unsure. But maybe because the actual time of Makas B'choros will be just before or just after midnight. No doubts. Especially if you consider the Levush's question. Even if I, as a human, were to say around 6 o'clock or around midnight, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not sure when it's going to happen. It's just that I'm not really paying attention to that level of detail. I'm not getting into the exact numbers. I'm rounding it off to the closest. Samach 2, it's close to 100. It's close to midnight. So the time the Pashas is now obviously you cannot use this explanation when referring to Hashem. We could say, I'll be there round about midnight. And it doesn't mean I'm unsure, it just means I'm not really that specific about the time. But in this context, by the Eibishter, it's not going to work. Because later when Makas B'choros actually happens, there the Torah says clearly that it was exactly at midnight that Hashem struck all of the firstborns. As Makas B'choros given genoi b'chatzi alayla, nit samach lachatzos. In other words, it was exactly midnight, not close to midnight. Therefore, it would be disingenuous of us to suggest that Moshe is not being specific because the time is not relevant. The time is relevant. The Eibishter wants it to be exactly at midnight. But even though it's clear that Moshe's message cannot be that the Eibishter is unsure or the Eibishter doesn't care when it's going to be, that's not Rashi's message over here. Why not? If the only reason Rashi knows that we can't say kachatzos alayla just simply as in doubt, because later on we'll see when the plague happens that it's precise, Rashi should have told us something about this. Rashi should have quoted those words in his commentary here, so we'd know why it's unacceptable to believe that the Eibishter wasn't being specific about the time. Because this is an axiom of Rashi. Because Rashi does not base an explanation on information that the child learning Chumash for the first time has not yet encountered. So if there's information later in the pasuk, he will quote it. Especially because we already know something about this midnight. Remember when Avraham Avinu went to rescue Lot, and it says there that he split the night as well. There, bringt Rashi Arab from Medrash Haggadah, Rashi quoted from a Medrash, that at that point the night was split into two, and the second half of the night was preserved for the great miracles of the Exodus from Egypt. So therefore, it's in verbunden dafke. So therefore, Rashi's already given us precedent and insight over there that when it talks about the second half of the night or the midnight of the striking Egypt, it's not about the specific exact time of when the Egyptian firstborns would be struck, but it's just talking about the second half as opposed to the first half of the night. So if Rashi is now changing his perspective over here and telling us that the exact time is relevant because it says later, Rashi would have to tell us this now, because so far the information we have from Rashi's own commentary is that we're not so concerned about the exact time of when Makas B'choros happens. But Rashi doesn't do so. But just simply says the first explanation is to explain the simplest understanding of the context of the pasuk is mashma. That indicates that there's something about the simple understanding of this pasuk without any information from before or from after that causes us to have to explain kach chatzos. We need to know what that is. But before we get there, 4 questions on the details of what Rashi has told us. First question, how do we know that the first explanation is simpler than the second? We have to understand. Aleph, mit was ist der erste Pirush von Rashi? Mehr pshutoi wie der zweite Pirush. What about the first explanation Rashi offers makes it closer to the pshat than the second? Rashi ruft on drash. The second commentary is one which Rashi says belongs to the world of Medrash. Now, the easiest way that we would want to explain it, but it's not going to work, is to say, well, the word chatzos doesn't really mean half, midnight. And then try and reread what Rashi has said as that the splitting of the night is the simplest explanation in context. Now we'll insert a reason into that. Because the word chatzos does not mean midnight. Which would imply that principle, that chatzos not being midnight, is the reason for this explanation. We cannot do that because the word chatzos appears in Tehillim and in Eov. And in both cases, it is clearly used to mean midnight. So we can't assume that Rashi is telling us Ein chatzos, generically, chatzos is not a meaning of midnight. So rather what Rashi must be telling us over here is as follows. Here, in context, to give an explanation that fits the pshat of the pasuk, we have to innovate an insight that in this context, unlike other contexts, chatzos does not mean midnight. Now, if you're doing that, if normally chatzos does mean midnight, why is the simpler explanation now to say the pshat in this case is not like chatzos in other places in Tanakh, but rather it means splitting the night into two? Which has no parallel elsewhere in Tanakh. On the Pirush, as das meint, Samach Chatzos is not Inyan Shel Drash. And then to suggest that Kach Chatzos means around about midnight, that is not Pshat. Why? Why is this more Pshat without precedent in Tanakh, and that less Pshat? Und auf as if he's a Dafman Zogan, as Moshe hat gesagt, Chatzos gedei zu bewohnen, Shema itu chulei. Even though, if we're going to go with the second explanation, the only reason Moshe changed Hashem's words to say Chatzos is in case they get the timing wrong. The fact is, that's something that the human mind can comprehend and say, yes, that is Pshat. It does make sense. People get the time wrong, even today, with our perfect timekeeping devices. Question 2. Why is Rashi concerned about them thinking Moshe is a fake? Why is Rashi concerned that the astrologers are going to accuse Moshe of being some kind of a jester? Why would Moshe take into consideration the possibility, which might even be a remote possibility, that they're going to accuse him of being untrue? Why would Moshe take that so clearly as fact? And what's going to happen at the end? All the firstborns of Egypt will all die at the same time, but not exactly midnight on the dot. That's going to make everybody think that Moshe is a liar, a faker, a trickster. They all died as he promised, all at once, as he promised, around about midnight, as he promised. That would be enough reason for Moshe to take that all into consideration and change Hashem's words exactly at midnight, to use different words around about midnight? Other question is, why is it relevant over here that Eibishter does know the precise time? The conclusion of Rashi's commentary, where he says the Eibishter knows exact times and therefore does say Bachatzos, we already know numerous times, the Rebbe has told us, is even in those circumstances where Rashi does quote Midrashim, which is not typical, is a nomadic he'll only bring the part of the quotation that is relevant to settle the simplest understanding of the pasuk, not the entire quotation if it's not relevant. In which case we have to ask. Yes, Rashi is quoting the rabbis, a medrash. What about the simple understanding of this pasuk requires us to know that elsewhere when Hashem spoke to Moshe, he told him it would be exactly at midnight? Which is then going to force us to analyze this pasuk as Moshe changing Hashem's words. The Mefarshim go into great detail about this. Why don't we just say, from a pshat perspective, that the Eibishter told Moshe to tell Pharaoh around about midnight, so that they don't get the time wrong or whatever? Why is it relevant for us to hear, to know, don't worry, the Eibishter knows the time? And the last question is, if Rashi is explaining the word kachatzois, why does he include the word halayla in his heading? Why does Rashi also quote the word alayla leche'era? Surely the only thing that Rashi is really interpreting is the meaning of the word kachatzois. That should be the only word in his heading. In order to understand all of this, let's pay attention to one important thing that Rashi said. He did not say we're explaining pshat and left it at that. He said we're explaining the pshat of the psukim in context. So what is the context that's bothering Rashi? Not the word that's bothering him, but the context. Rashi will understand all of this by paying attention to the exact words Rashi used, where he said, Zeu pshutoi, this is the simplest explanation, le yashvoi al oifenov, in order to settle the interpretation in context. Which apparently is words that Rashi didn't have to use. Rashi could have just said, as he says multiple times, this is the simple explanation, and then the second explanation, Rabbi saying this is the midrashic explanation. Why did Rashi do this? No, Rashi wants to draw our attention to the fact as the Schwerigkeit in the Verta Kachatzois HaLayla, the issue that has to be addressed over here, what's difficult to understand when the pasuk says Kachatzois HaLayla, charismatic, that's why he quotes both of those words in his heading. It's nicht mit seinem Pirush vom Wort kachatzois und afil nicht zu lieben tam, was es lässt sich also nicht teitschen klappe meile. He's not worried about the interpretation of the word kachatzois and if that's an appropriate thing to say about the Eibishter. Now, there's something about the entire content and context of this pasuk which needs to be addressed. Namely, we need an explanation of the pshat, which is going to settle the context, which is, as the we need an explanation that's going to fit these words in the overall message of this pasuk. Meaning what? The beer in them. The first time you read this pasuk, the Eibush is telling Moshe to tell Pharaoh that at midnight I'm going to attack Egypt. Immediately you should have a very simple question. Why is it relevant for Moshe to convey to Pharaoh that the time where the Eibush is going to go out to strike Egypt will be midnight or around midnight? Why is it relevant? It would be ridiculous to suggest it's because the Eibishter needs Pharaoh to know what time the Makkah is going to happen. Because we don't find in most of the other Makkahs that the time was a relevant part of the conversation that the Eibishter needed Pharaoh to know. In fact, there are 3 places where it is even remotely part of the conversation. Dever, Borod, und Arbe. Those are the 3 Makkos where the Eibishter does give a time, but let's pay attention to what the Eibishter said. It's by Dever und Arbe hat the Eibishter given den Tog, Mochar, und nicht die Schon Tog. When it comes to Dever and Arbe, all the message was from Hashem via Moshe to Pharaoh is, it's happening tomorrow. In other words, what day the plague will start, not what time, like here. And by Borod, and the only time where you have the time and the day is Borod, where Hashem tells Moshe to tell Pharaoh at exactly this time, tomorrow, Borod is going to happen. And as Rashi tells us, Moshe made a mark on the wall so that when the sun would hit the same mark the following day, that's when borrowed would happen. So there is a practical reason why the time was relevant in that plague. Because that was the plague where there was a warning to those people who fear the word of Hashem that they should there was a warning because they needed to be able to put their own livestock and their slaves out of the direct reach of borrowed to protect them. So they have to know by when they have to protect themselves. Here, nobody's being protected by knowing the time. Why is it important for Pharaoh to know the time that Ani Yoitze, the Eibush, is going to strike Mitzrayim? Especially when you consider, in this case, when the Eibush tells Pharaoh the time, he doesn't tell him the day. He just says, Kachatzos Alaylo is when he's going to strike. Pharaoh is going to be as much in the dark as with any of the other plagues because he won't know which day he should anticipate that the Eibush is going to strike the firstborns at midnight. Therefore, we have to conclude, Al Pi Pshat, that the intention in sharing that information, is not to provide information to Pharaoh of the timing of the plague. Rather, it is part of the description of the nature and quality of this plague. In other words, the fact that this plague happens at this unusual midnight hour is evidence of the fact that the Eibush is personally engaging in this plague. The Eibush himself is going into Mitzrayim, bringing the plague with him, as the Eibush has already told Moshe to convey to Pharaoh. You will then know that there is nothing and no one like the Eibush. So now we have to understand what's the quality, what's the nature of the plague, knowing that the Eibush is doing it at midnight. What value is there in knowing that the plague happens at or around midnight? That's going to really show us this amazing interaction that the Eibush is personally involved. To the contrary. At Makas Barad, Pharaoh already realized that the Eibishter's timing is immaculate. In the Rega was the Eibishter hat Pharaoh is gesagt, Ka'is Mochar, exactly the time that the Eibishter predicted through Moshe, this time tomorrow, when the sun beams strike the same piece of wall, that's when the hail will happen. Surely now it's looking like a weaker presentation. You've already shown that the Eibishter's timing is perfect, and now Moshe is saying around about Chatzos, it's not even a clear time. That's what's bothering Rashi. What's the value in sharing this information? It actually seems counterproductive. Therefore, the Rebbe is Rashi Meforish. Therefore, Rashi says no. As the key over here is not the time on the watch, but rather the fact that the night is being split into two. That moment of splitting the first and second parts of the night is highly precise. It's even more precise than the time that Barad was to begin. Why is that? Because the chilek zwischen die zwei Pfannen wie zu ausdrücken dem Zman von Chatzia Laila, Chatzais Laila oder Kei Choleka Laila is because the difference between saying either midnight, which is a time, or Kei Choleka Laila, when the night is being split, which is a process, the difference is this. Chatzais Laila it's wegen Zman Musuyom. Midnight is a time on the watch. Kei Choleka Laila, when Meshach Laila zetelt sich auf zweien, the splitting of the night in two, is Mataynitzman nor a Peula, that's a description of an action, not a time. By Safas, die Dazike Peula tut sich auf nicht in a Hemschachsman or in a Kudefundsman, especially when you consider that particular moment of the division of the night into two, is a moment, it's in a split hair, as we shall see, rather than a process. Midnight might be considered part of a process of the night. That moment of splitting the night from its first to second part is not a piece of time, meaning to say, was man kennes mesten, a time frame that could be measured, a man kennes messen darf sich nicht schalig werden, halb zu dem ersten Chatzei Leila und die zweiten halb zu dem zweiten. Think about it. If it's let's say a minute, then you'd say the first 30 seconds belong to the first half of the night, and the second 30 seconds belong to the second half of the night. Und das ist der Aufruf von Chatzei Leila. That's the point over here about saying, as the night splits, that's when the Eibush is going to strike. The Eibush wird herausgehen Punkt in den Nekuda von Chelek Leila. The Eibush is going to initiate Makas Bechoros at exactly that precise moment where the night splits into its second half. Something only the Eibush can do, because the Eibush knows his times and his moments. Sabanit moving, okay, might not still be clear. So why then does the Eibush say Kachatzois through Moshe to Pharaoh, a word that could be interpreted as we've seen in two ways, the splitting of the night or the midnight. Look, we had to bring proofs to illustrate that this makes sense. Not even one proof. And the proofs that we bring, that Rashi brings, are not even similar to ours, because they have a base instead of a chuf. So why do we need all of this? Besides the fact that the proofs that Rashi brings are proofs of processes that began but then continued, and we're looking for a process that is split second. Here we're looking for just that moment. Surely the Torah could have avoided all of this by the Eibush telling Moshe to tell Pharaoh, at exactly precisely Chatzos, that's when it's going to happen. That's why the first explanation isn't absolutely sufficient. Rashi needs a second. Whereas the second explanation is not so simple, according to the Pshat, to refer to actual midnight and then say we're talking around about midnight. It actually seems to undo the main message of the Pshat. As Moshe hat angegeben, and it's really a stretch to say that Moshe stands in front of Pharaoh saying, Hashem, and then immediately says a word differently to what the Eibush just said. But what will be clear, even according to the second explanation, is that the Eibush's timing is perfect. And therefore there are no doubts in Hashem's world. When the Eibush is describing what is going to happen, then the Eibush says, and that emphasizes that the Eibishter will personally take care of this strike against the greatest Egyptian, all the way down to the one who's a slave working behind the millstones. Because if we're not using this to illustrate that it's the Eibishter personally attacking Egypt at this point, there is no other value to knowing that it is at midnight. Rabbi what the Medrash does help us with is that when Moshe had to convey the Eibish's message to Pharaoh, then Moshe did say different words or a different word to what Hashem had said, in case they get it wrong. And there's no question Moshe Rabbeinu doing this. It was exactly what the Eibishter wanted. Truth is, there's something even deeper that we're going to clarify over here, and that is that there's a question of Asfrekten Ganzen ob dem Erschen Pirush, a question that is so powerful that actually seems to undo the entire first explanation Rashi gave. The first explanation is all predicated on the concept that means that moment where the night splits from the first Gevura part of the night to the second Chesed part of the night. Was nur der Eibishter kann es mechaven sein, that's something only the Eibishter can identify. Und ein Mensch kann das nicht mavchen sein, and there's no way for a human to detect that moment. Was wird zukommen durch mit dir sein Paaren und seine Chatumim und kol Mitzrayim wegen dem. So why tell anybody something they can't identify? Beshas und sie alle werden es sei, wenn ihr kann mechaven sein. So Pharaoh and all of his team are not going to be able to tell when the time is anyway, so why bother telling them when the time's going to be if they can't identify it? And they would never know if exactly at the time that the night splits is when the Eibishter hit. So those wird verändert durch Rashi's bringen bei Arichas Shena Medrash. So because there is that question about the first interpretation, Kehei Cholek, but nobody's going to know when Kehei Cholek is, that's why Rashi brings more information from the second explanation than what appeared to be necessary for the second explanation. The first thing Rashi does is quotes the Medrash saying, who's going to make the mistake? The astrologers. Now, we don't have any evidence of that in the pasuk. Why is Rashi introducing it over here? Because Rashi wants us to know we're not concerned about Pharaoh and his lackeys because they would never know when this time is anyway. Because remember, who's Moshe talking to? Pharaoh and his team of so-called experts who are there to prove that they can replicate the plagues using their own sorcery. So the question of why bother telling them that this plague is going to happen at exactly that precise point where the night splits, if they have no means of determining when that is that is relevant and correct with regards to Pharaoh and the average Egyptian. But there is an exception. It's Stagnine Pharaoh, the astrologers. That's their business. They are, their entire trade is to look at the astrology and work out what's going on. The times, that's their thing. And Pharaoh takes them seriously. They are his consultants. He acts on their advice. Which means that they actually have the know-how to determine the time frame that David is talking about. But they, as we know very well about astrologers, are not always precise, and maybe they'll get it wrong. That's what David wants Moshe to bavarn, to avoid. But then Rashi adds another piece of information that David knows the exact times by telling us that Rashi is reminding us of something he said all the way back at the beginning of Bereshis. When the Torah tells us that David finished the creation on the seventh day, which raises a question because doesn't it say he rested on the seventh day? So Rashi quotes Rabbi Shimon and says, the unlike us, we don't know our times exactly that perfectly and precisely. We've got to take a bit of time before Shabbos just to be sure that we don't accidentally transgress on Shabbos. But David knows the times perfectly and therefore finishes at a hairbreadth time frame before Shabbos comes in. The Pshat Tefun is, in other words, what Rashi told us then, if a human being uses highly precise equipment, then you can get a rega down to that level of detail. But a rega has a specific amount. The Gemara gives us two possibilities. 158,888th of an hour, or it is the amount of time it says to say the word rega, all of three letters. But with the right equipment, we can measure it. But when you say over here, like Rabbi Shimon does, that the Eibusher is able to get a hairbreadth of time accurate, that's something we don't have any capacity to be able to measure. It is too quick for us. Even the astrologers of Pharaoh, including Bilam, who later on says and boasts that he knows the exact moment when the Eibusher is angry. Rashi wants us to know this very specific moment, which is like a chut hasaira. None of them could assess, none of them could identify, only Hashem himself. And that's why Rashi says the Eibishter, who knows his times perfectly, says Bachatzos is going to be exactly at midnight. So by saying Bachatzos, Rashi wants us to know that the Eibishter's message is not just the precise moment which a human, through a lot of effort, could determine. Says the Ibn Ezra says you've got to have scientific equipment to be able to identify when this time is. Now, this is the chut tasayra fun chatzos, but rather what's happening at the time that the Eibishter himself is revealing himself. It must be a time that only the Eibishter can identify. No human, no equipment, no technology can find it. The chut tasayra, the hairbreadths of the splitting of the night, was das ken mechaven zayin nor kadosh baruch hu was yedei itov uragov. Only the Eibishter, who knows times perfectly, could identify this time, could strike at this time, could take the Eden out of Mitzrayim, and Hashem in rega kameimra will take us out of this galus with Mashiach now.